Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Nadine. I would be remiss if I didn't do a shout out to Harris Rosamund, our newest LABC member. For those of you who don't know him, he's come and he's going to be working on homelessness and housing and also policy and legislative issues. So if you get a chance, say hi to Harris tonight. It is my honor to introduce Paul Maslin, our featured speaker this evening. But first, I want to talk for a moment about the positions the LABC has taken. As you know, this is going to be a very important election year in November, probably one of the most important ones of our lifetime. And along with it are some state and local initiatives that we have taken positions on. We're most proud that we will be supporting Prop 16, the Opportunity for All Act, which will repeal Prop 209. This will help us with our small business work because basically it will allow for general racial and ethnic diversity to be considered in all public employment, public contracting, and public education. So it's really important. So vote yes on Prop 16. We also supported LAUSD's $7 billion bond. Many of our members were responsible for building the schools over the last 20 years. This bond will repair and bring up to code the existing schools and also help with new technology, particularly internet technology for the students and to create safety in the schools. Two of the major initiatives that we're actually opposing is the Prop 15 vote no, which is the California Schools and Local Communities funding. This is really the split roll, even though you wouldn't know it from its name. We do have an issue with that. It would tax commercial and industrial real estate property at current market value, which at this point, given what's going on to our small businesses and our building owners, this would be counterproductive and add more costs. We're also going to oppose Prop 21, the Rental Affordability Act. This is the Weinstein initiative that's back again. It was defeated once, but apparently it's back. And this would basically tell local governments that they can establish rent control on residential properties over 15 years old. So tonight, Paul is going to address some of these statewide initiatives. He is a partner at Fairbank, Maslin, Maullin, Metz Associates, better known as FM3 Research. They have done very good work for us over the years. Paul's former partner, who unfortunately has passed, Richard Maullin, our good friend, conducted a very important poll for us on clean energy several years ago that led to the adoption of the LADWP rooftop solar program. And we really appreciate the work you did for us, Paul. Tonight, Paul's here to discuss the November elections, specifically the state and local measures and what the electoral roadmap will look like in 2020. Paul was Governor Gray Davis's pollster. He has also helped many elected officials and worked on many initiative campaigns, too many to mention, but significant for all of us this year. He really has helped a lot of women elected officials and was responsible for Tammy Baldwin and Kirsten Sinema Senate races, successful Senate races, in addition to reelecting Patty Murray 3 times. And he currently has one of the most challenging races, which is the reelect for Doug Jones, U.S. Senator Doug Jones in Alabama, who, as you know, got elected back in 2018. His research firm, FM3, is one of the leading public opinion research and strategy firms in both California and across the country. So we are thrilled to have Paul with us tonight. Thank you, Paul. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mary, for that nice introduction, which she asked me to try to write. And thank you, Nadine and Brad. It's really a pleasure. I'm going to try to keep this. There's a lot to cover. And, even before COVID and all that's happened the last 6 months, when people would ask me about this election, I'd always say my head hurts. It's so anyone who thinks they have a crystal ball and think they know exactly what's going to happen ought to have their head examined. It's a tricky and complicated election. I'll try to be as brief as I can, cover a lot of those key areas that Mary mentioned, and then just open it up. I'm sure you'll have a bunch of questions. I'm going to start with just the nature of the election itself and voting, which has been much discussed, and say a few things about what I think will happen in terms of the actual process of voting. I think California luckily has had enough experience with vote by mail that I think probably it will be, there'll always be a hitch, but probably will be able to be executed fairly successfully. There's going to be one key difference, though, and that is that we've already sort of tested this. We think that a majority of Californians, perhaps as much as 2/3, are going to cast their ballots in the first week or two at most after receiving them. So since everyone's voting by mail, you could literally have half the votes cast in that very first week of October and another 15 or 20% cast a week or two later, which means that for all these campaign strategists doing a variety of initiative campaigns or candidate campaigns, they have to be armed with the knowledge that there'll be many fewer voters to try to convince to support their view in the final weeks of October and those last, couple of weeks or so than has been habitually the case. And that generally we used to feel in California, it's all the old, more conservative people that'll vote first. And from what we can tell this year, it's now a flip. And this is a more important question nationally. Clearly, Democrats have already made a judgment in their mind. I believe the virus is real. I believe there's risk going to a polling place. Give me a mail ballot. That's how I'll vote. And states are grappling, as we know, with the whole thing about the Postal Service, grappling with the whole method of voting and how well can it be executed, how much will the results be delayed, et cetera. Up until a few weeks ago, Republican consultants were scared to death that they had messaged this horribly for their voters, making them afraid to vote by mail, which is maybe basically the method of choice, and that heading toward a polling place where things may or may not seem safe when they actually go to vote in early November. But I've had a couple of conversations with Democratic consultants the last few days who are also worried about whether people are going to vote or how they'll vote or are we sending mixed messages, et cetera. Bottom line is tremendous cloud over the voting process. And that cloud may not easily go away after November 3rd. I think we all understand, without elucidating all the details about how this election could become contested, wrangled over, may go on for quite some time. As we all know, we've had California elections that don't get decided for days and often weeks after November 3rd. We always used to joke, what if the whole country was like California? Well, guess what? We're heading in that direction. So it is a very uncertain dynamic. That's for sure. I would simply say about the presidential race, I got asked the question earlier. It's an absolutely legitimate question. Wasn't Hillary ahead by a similar amount in 2016? Why do we think that Biden's necessarily going to win? And all I'll say, and I'll do this briefly, there were reasons that most of the national polls were actually correct in 2016. It was the state polls that missed Trump's movement. Some of it is that movement was late. My question this year is, after 3.5 years of voters making assessments of Donald Trump, and those assessments have solidified and been converted to a voting decision by significant numbers of voters in the last 6 months. It's not just that I disapprove of his presidency. I don't think I'm going to vote for him anymore. And clearly a significant percentage that took Biden from just being a couple of points ahead here or there to a significant, somewhere between a 7, 8, 9, 10-point lead in most of the national polls right now. What will change that dynamic? And I would argue, absent doubts about Biden himself, which could rise. That's not without beyond the realm of possibility. But in terms of the basic judgment about Donald Trump, I don't think it's going to differ very much. So he's got an uphill fight in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. He's losing in Arizona. He's been losing in most polls in Florida. North Carolina is close. He has to win most of those states. He can't lose more than 2 or 3 of those states and have any chance of retaining the presidency. So I think that very tentatively here in the middle of August, right now, the prospects look good for Biden. But the big but is, what if the lead narrows? What if the 8-point lead becomes a 5-point lead? Now the electoral college states come back into play. And how much of a certainty about their outcome will we know on November 3rd or even November 4th or even November 5th? And it's very conceivable that we could have the kind of wrangle over an election outcome that'll make 2000 and the fight in Florida, which ended up at the Supreme Court, look like peanuts, to be blunt about it. So there's a great deal of uncertainty there. I think the Democrats are very likely to win back the Senate. They have a number of, as Mary mentioned, I'm doing one of the races where the Democrats are the most vulnerable with Doug Jones, and we're slightly behind, but certainly not to be counted out there yet. But the problem for the Republicans is that there are at least a half dozen similar races on their side of the ledger right now, where Democrats either have a lead or have a substantially good chance to win. And of course, if Biden wins the presidency, Democrats only need to win a net 3 seats, and then they'll have the tiebreaker with Kamala Harris as the vice president. So without going into all the details, I'll simply state that as of now, there are enough seats to make you think the Democrats ought to be favored, not overwhelming yet, but certainly the favorites to win back the Senate. So there is certainly a fair possibility that we could end up going to entire Democratic rule in terms of both houses of Congress. I don't think there'll be a lot of seats that change places. I'll talk about California in a second in terms of the House. On the propositions, and let me first state, I think there's going to be a pretty good turnout in California. And to the extent we've gotten a little bit of a hint of this, to the extent it may get tamped down, I still wonder about some of the disaffected Republicans who are not wild about Trump and know he's going to lose big in California, and whether there'll be enough motivation for them to vote. Will like a Prop 15, or there are a handful of congressional races, as we know, but they still only make up 12 to 15% of the overall state vote. Is there enough incentive for some of those disaffected Republicans to turn out? And could that end up being the slight alteration in terms of the electorate in California that might have some impact on some of these statewide races and or other campaigns? I think split roll prop, we all call it split roll, Prop 15, which Mary talked about, very, very close in a lot of the polling. It frankly is not at the level of support that is generally needed to withstand a huge and expensive campaign against it. But on the other hand, you can't count it out either, because there are some strong allies on the side of voting yes on that measure. And I think it's yet to be determined how it'll play out. It could be a very close call in terms of that. 16 is interesting. We did some polling early on that right after the George Floyd death and the first wave of protests that we saw in late May and early June, and before the actual ballot label, which there now is, of course, there wasn't an absolute correlation between changing attitudes about the whole question of police brutality and what that said about our society, and Prop 209 and whether it should be overturned or not. There is a little bit of lag, or a little bit of noise between position A and position B. Having said that, though, I do think the dynamic, I noticed today, as Mary said, you all are supporting it. Every sports team in the Bay Area has come out. I believe all the baseball, football teams, basketball, whatever, they've all come out in favor of Prop 16, which is a very unique kind of dynamic, and not typical that you'd ever hear the Golden State Warriors taking a viewpoint on some proposition that affected the people of California. So I think while the polling has been a little more suspect, I think there's reason to think that support may grow in terms of Prop 16, but I would not say that it's an absolute definite yet. As I said, there are some of the diversity that came together in those marches on George Floyd breaks down a little bit when you get into the whole question of affirmative action. Obviously, different constituencies in the state and different ethnic groups have different feelings about some of the outcomes that have taken place in higher education and other places. We have a 17-year-old voting age, by the way, and it's going to lose. As much as it might make sense to have 17-year-olds vote in a primary when they're going to become 18 and vote in the general, the public probably thinks it's a bridge too far. And then we're involved. Another one that's going to get a lot of attention is Prop 22, which is essentially Uber and Lyft. Just full disclosure, I'm on the other side of that issue. But the app-based ride-sharing companies, essentially in reaction to AB 5, are going to try to reclassify their employees as independent contractors and not full-time employees, and And essentially, that's what that fight's going to be about. And it will be a pretty substantial one with a lot of resources on both sides. So you'll see a lot of campaigning on Prop 22. I would simply say that the other thing to watch in California will be a lot of the congressional races. Frankly, the bigger danger for the Democrats may come in 2022, when history tells you a lot of the races that you win as you gain greater power. And in this case, 2018 obviously was a surprisingly good election for Democrats, winning a half dozen House seats, many of which were really viewed as long shots or certainly not likely to turn. One of them went back. Obviously, that was the Katie Hill seat. But most of the others, I think most people believe the Democrats ought to be able to withstand. They have a better electorate, and they ought to be able to withstand whatever Republican campaign is coming after them in those races. But 2022 could be a very different situation, particularly if Democrat, unfortunately in our politics, you gain total control and boom, now you're responsible for everything. And the voters, if they're nasty or angry or, have some kind of cross to bear, they're going to come after you as the incumbent party. And 2022 could very well be a more difficult election for Democrats if they get total control. So I think they'll still be close, some of the congressional seats. My guess is the Democrats are going to hang on to the vast majority of them, if not all of them, and they have an outside chance of getting CD 25 back. So that's just a lay of the land. I don't know what else to add other than I'd be happy to take any questions. I think someone asked about the debates earlier. And even these conventions, they've been interesting. I thought the roll call of votes was the best thing of all when, we could actually see people, including the guy in Rhode Island offering us calamari. I thought that was wonderful. But it was a different touch for the conventions. I tend to think when all is said and done, these conventions will not be all that crucial. Biden's going to give a speech tonight, but, he'll do it as well as he can. It's not the same thing as speaking in a hall of 15,000 people. And then, how many debates that occur and what they'll be like and what the format will be like could be fairly important. But generally, debates tend to reinforce. If Donald Trump needs to move people away and persuade them, he's going to have a pretty high bar to try to cross, particularly when it seems like the only and I remember so well, back I'm old enough to remember 1980 when we Democrats thought I was working for Jimmy Carter that year. Oh, Reagan, he's an old man. He's an actor. Come on. And Ronald Reagan got up there in the one debate that occurred that year between him and Jimmy Carter, and he was darn good. And a whole lot of people said, I could vote for him. Why not? And it seems that the only thing Trump has said that, that's a problem with Biden is that he's Sleepy Joe, or he's Slow Joe, or whatever he's calling him, that, he's got difficulty with his mental faculties. So he's almost setting it up for Biden. Got through the debate fine, didn't make any mistakes, managed to put sentences together. Is that enough? So we'll see. But as with every aspect of this election, it's still unpredictable. We've still gone through an extraordinary experience in these last 6 months, yet to be played out, with a pandemic still raging, with all the economic dislocation, with a variety of other concerns that people have. I'm certainly not going to sit here on August 20th and tell you, oh, it's all locked up. There's no way. This still could turn, and we still may have an awful lot of suspense in front of us. Mary, you're on mute.
Paul.
Great.
Hi, that was a great overview. Thank you for sharing that. And can we ask you a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. On Prop 15, does that require 50% or 2/3?
It's 50%.
It's just 50%, but right now you think it's a toss-up?
Very much a toss-up. I haven't seen a lot of polling with it over 50%. Generally, it's been right around or a little bit under. And, there are exceptions to every rule. Trust me on this. But generally, we've all come to believe that when you have a ballot measure and you have substantial opposition from wherever it's coming, and there will be a lot of money spent against you, you like to have the cushion of knowing that you go into the race well over 50%. Sometimes you need to be over 60%, frankly, to withstand. I always say that in a ballot measure, there are all kinds of ways to get people to vote no. I'm confused. Vote no. I like some of it. I don't like that. Vote no. Isn't they're hiding something in here? Aren't they trying to fool me? Vote no. We don't need to do this now. Why don't we wait and do it later? Vote no. Why can't the legislature do this? Vote no. Whereas a yes vote requires, I think this is important and I think it ought to happen now. It's always a tougher standard. So again, it's an interesting. It's not without strength that measure, but I'd say, Mary, that it's still in a fairly vulnerable position right now.
Got it. And this Prop 16. So every major sports team in the Bay Area is
happened today. They all came out for it. It stunned me.
And so do you think that's part of the statement about how seriously they're taking equity and equality and a new economy and a new way of doing business? Yeah.
And, unfortunately, these culture wars won't end anytime soon. But clearly, the NFL players are going to be kneeling for the anthem, which they were not prepared to do when Colin Kaepernick first surfaced the issue of police brutality 4 or 5 years ago. And there'll be significant parts of the country that won't like that. And people will still be fighting it. But Mary, I haven't had a chance to really process it, but I was surprised to see it. And I think it is definitely an outgrowth of George Floyd. I mean, we may look back. I'll say this advisedly because, again, history is in control. It's in the saddle here, and events are in the saddle, not us. But to me, we may look back and find that the two most important events of this year, even beyond the pandemic itself, were, in fact, the death of George Floyd and then Donald Trump's decision to walk into Lafayette Square with the Bible, which I felt like he took a hit after that. And I think it was a character hit. I don't think he's recovered from it, to be honest. In any, and you never know with Trump because life goes on and all the things accumulate and they all tend to blur together. But I felt like in those moments, this country sort of stood up and said, "Who are we?" Now, it's not simple, and it's not going to be an easy, clean aftermath. And a lot of these questions are yet to be debated. But anyway, that tells you something about Prop 16, Mary, that there was that kind of support.
And tell me, today, Lyft and Uber made a lot of news. How is Prop 22 doing?
I will simply state I don't want to give away my campaign's strategy or too much of our information, but I will simply say that they have been talking about shutting down their operations. At the very least, I'm not sure if it includes the food delivery, but at the very least, their ride-sharing operations, essentially in protests over AB 5. And in some ways, I don't know whether they think it'll help them from a message standpoint in making their point before the actual election and people vote on Prop 22. But they're not going to be able to do that. There was an injunction, I believe, that happened today. So that is going to be taken off the table. I think they don't have a very good ballot label. It was changed over the summer, and I think it now works somewhat against them, but they have huge resources. They've been talking about $100 million that they're going to try to put into this campaign. And obviously there are cross-pressured people, you know them in places like LA or the Bay Area who use Uber and Lyft, or did at least prior to COVID, and have kind of an appreciation for that service and importance. Yet at the same time might also object to what they feel might be a denial of benefits to the actual drivers of Uber and Lyft. And so there's going to be most Democratic, the three biggest cities have sued Uber and Lyft, LA, San Francisco, and San Diego. There's going to be a lot of pushback from the Democratic side in this campaign, but it'll be an interesting race.
Yeah, no, I think I didn't realize you actually had that race, but
Yeah.
thanks for explaining that. Okay, so back to here in LA County. What is your take on the turnout in LA County, and how might that impact the Wesson Mitchell race?
Yeah, that's a close race. I will simply say that, again, I'm going to start from the premise that it's a presidential year with a buildup, the likes of which, while it is many faceted and confusing, and some people say, well, it's automatic that if they protested, they'll vote. Well, that's not automatic. There are some people that may feel that the act of getting out into the street and protesting supersedes voting, and that voting is not necessarily as effective or might even be counterproductive. But I still think, Mary, in general, with all of what we've been exposed to these last 3.5 years, and to come to a judgment day or month, given that we're voting by mail,
Right.
I tend to think that's still going to lead toward a bigger turnout in LA County. I think LA County will be, and the Latino vote will be a crucial part of that. Again, there's still some doubt or question among some people about how much of a reaction there will be to, the various events of the last 3.5 years and some of the rhetoric, and whether Trump has made any inroads there at all. But regardless, I still tend to think it's a bigger turnout when you're an incumbent like Herb Wesson. That's always a little bit worrisome because you don't know who the extra voters are. But that's a very close race.
So when you say larger turnout, are we talking 60%, 50, 60% of the voters?
I think whatever 2016 was, I'd take it up a few points. And I'm drawing a blank now of the actual.
I feel like in presidential years we get to those kind of numbers.
Yeah, generally, I would say if it's been 60, I would say this one could push to 62 or 63. Okay. 2008 was in many ways, because of Obama, the biggest turnout we've ever seen. And then 2012 was still very high in selective states, not California, but it was high in the states where they fought over. And that's one reason why the Romney campaign actually were convinced that he was going to win. And they told Romney that day, and they had no idea how they were going to be simply just swamped by the Obama turnout machine in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, et cetera, which just in Florida, which just devastated them. But overall, the turnout dropped back. I think we're going to go higher than 2020 and maybe not as high as 2008. Higher than 2016, I'm sorry. Maybe not as 2000. Yeah.
So tell me, do you see any national polling that takes into account the potential impact of barriers being put in place to mail-in ballots?
There's no polling yet that's doing it. The only thing I will say is everyone, and this is thus not a coincidence, everyone started to find out about a month ago or so, as people started to realize that, that with the pandemic still going on, and frankly, the inability to staff polling places, let alone have voters come and wait in line. We had a primary here in Wisconsin, and after a lot of wrangling, they ended up holding it. And in that case, by the way, it was a Republican Supreme Court candidate who lost because Republicans refused to turn out. But the lines were horribly long, and that's just a dangerous predicament to put people in. So anyway, about a month ago, we meaning Democrats, Republicans, anybody who was starting to poll the subject, realized that Democrats were saying overwhelmingly, I'm going to vote by mail. And Republicans were saying overwhelmingly, I don't want to vote by mail. I don't trust it. And so that does set up a situation where you don't have to be a rocket scientist to say, which votes get counted? When do they get counted? Yeah. Which votes get challenged? Where is it going to? And by the way, I say this I'm not even being critical here. I'm not taking a partisan viewpoint. There is danger on both sides. As I said earlier, the initial worry was from Republican consultants who said, we're walking ourselves into a trap. Our people aren't going to take the option of voting by mail, and we're going to be dependent on them all turning out at the end, and some are going to be scared. That's their worry. Our worry is the one you raised, which is, our people want to vote by mail, but will they be able to? Will their ballots get lost? Will they be challenged? What will happen with the whole process? Will it break down? Or are they simply going to be, they're going to be counted, but they're not going to be counted for weeks later. And in the meantime, there's going to be a big cloud put over the whole race. So I don't want to be a doom and gloom person, but certainly any reading of this country and what's happened for many years, not just the last 3.5, but culminating in these last 3.5 years, would certainly make one worried about the aftermath of this race and how Joe Biden would love to win and bring us all together. He may do the first. The second is going to be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible.
With less than 3 months away from the election, what percentage of voters are still up for grabs, and what key factors could sway them?
I think in real terms is less than 10%. It may be in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 or 8. I think these are primarily people that have made a negative judgment about Donald Trump, but they are still either uncertain or nervous about Biden and the ideological bent of the Democratic Party, and perhaps their own self-interest when it comes to taxes or the economy or whatever. And so there's still an open question about whether they go back and cast the voters who disliked both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump voted overwhelmingly for Trump, over 2-1, many of them deciding late in 2016. So far, and I'll give you a classic example, the polls suggest voters who dislike both Biden and Trump are voting for Biden. Will that hold? The most vivid example I can tell you are millennials. I did a poll recently where I looked at the favorable ratings, and voters under 30 disliked Trump by about 8 points. Okay, that's about what I would expect. That same group, voters under 30, disliked Biden by 2-1. I went, wow, they really don't like Joe Biden one bit, do they? How are they voting? Dead even, which tells you that there were people in there. Some of them are Bernie people. Some of them are just young millennials who don't really know much about Biden or think he's old or passé or whatever. But even though they didn't like Biden, they're voting for him. If that holds, then he wins. If, on the other hand, Trump is able to push him back, in that you said, Mary, how big is it? If 6 or 7 or 8% are out there and Trump wins most of them back, then all of a sudden we don't have an 8-point race anymore. We've got a 4-point race or a 5-point race. And if we have a 4 or 5-point race, it is still not out of the question that the Electoral College can rear its head and he could have, if not a victory like 2016, at least close enough outcomes that there's a fight.
And the issues that could push them back?
I think they're going culture wars. I think they'd love to sell the economy. I think they've lost any chance to do it. It's too late in the game now. Even the market going up doesn't seem to have much impact. I think people, whether they blame Trump or not, is almost beside the point. Bottom line is he doesn't get credit. Whatever he did in 2017, 18, and 19 is off the board, and he doesn't get credit for it. He'll get a little bit of credit for a Middle East peace thing that they did the other day, but that's a foreign policy issue that's not going to be that critical. I still think he's going to go hard on Biden's going to raise your taxes. Biden's going to take away your guns. Biden's going to be is going to promote abortion on demand. Biden's going to welcome the immigrants back, and they have to go. That is the playbook where they have to go. Now, I think they will be helped along if Joe Biden gives people reason to start wondering. And again, I'm just going to make a prediction now. I could be dead wrong. I don't think we're going to see 3 debates. I just don't. Whether it'll be 1 or 2, I'm not sure. But I don't think it'll be 3.
And the Senate, do you have a prediction about the Senate?
It depends to some extent about how big the Biden win is. But if you take the more modest view that Biden doesn't win by 10, he wins by 6, I think that's enough to push states like Arizona and Colorado and very possibly Maine and Iowa and North Carolina, and there are a couple of seats in Georgia. I would not be shocked to see a 51-49 Democratic Senate, maybe even 52-48. The Senate races tend to go bigger than you think. That's our history, that when close elections in the Senate break, they break pretty dramatically and pretty clearly for one side over the other. So I don't think it would be a shock if the Democrats gain more than 3 seats. Maybe it could even be as much as 5 or 6. I won't predict that, but I think it's a possibility. But if you sort of put a gun to my head, Mary, I'd say it ends up 51-49 Democrat in the Senate.
And your race in Alabama, what would happen there?
It's going to be close. Check with me in a week. We're going to. This guy's a football coach.
Yeah.
Some people say, well, that's great. Alabama loves football. Okay. Let's see. Let's see how people really react when they really get a handle on kind of his real record. I mean, obviously, we're still an underdog. Alabama's a tough state. It voted over 25 points for Trump over Hillary. It'll be closer this time, but Biden's going to lose by, somewhere in the double digits. We have to get a certain amount of Trump voters to say, I'm going to go Donald Trump, but I'm willing to go for Jones, and here's a reason why. But we're not far behind. There have been some public polls that are just not accurate. I can tell you, we're down by a handful of points, and we're certainly in the game, and we're going to be pretty well funded. So it'll be a tight race.
Well, Paul, I thank you, because that was a lot of political acumen. You just tossed it at us in a very short period of time, and I bet you're 99% right in your predictions.
I'll take 80% this year.
Yeah, well, you've done this a few times, so you have a sense of it. But what I'm hearing you say is, it's still pretty fluid in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely, and I think the COVID part of it is what makes it more fluid. I mean, I'm not being partisan or sort of thinking about dastardly methods that could be going on here. I'm simply saying just confusion alone. This is a difficult election for people to get their hands on, and what do I do, and how do I do it, and when do I do it, and all of that with an overhang of none of us know. The spike in July, or June and July, a lot of people didn't see that coming. We thought we were over the worst of it, and boom. We don't know what's going to happen to all these kids coming back to school. What if it's a bunch of college towns where Democrats do really well, by the way? What if those are the places where the infection rates jump dramatically? Well, then do Democrats lose some votes because some of their people are and because vote by mail is not so simple, are scared away from the polling place, and that might be critical in a state like Wisconsin or Michigan that could be really close. So, North Carolina, I mean, they literally the whole campus just went virtual after trying out people going to class for a week. So all kinds of variables, Mary.
Yeah, no, this is going to be the most interesting election, I think, ever. The thought that people are in one place, is that going to help or hurt? And the way voter suppression has gone this time, we won't know till it happens, right? For real. So there's a lot of hope that it'll be bigger than usual, right? This could be the biggest turnout we've ever seen in our lives, right? Possibly, or at the very least, close to 2008. Yeah, no, that would. Let's hope for that. I want to go out on that thought that we're gonna get there. And I want to thank you, Paul, for your time tonight and the work your firm does and the work you've done for us, because we really appreciate it, and it's really been quite meaningful in terms of our ability to get public policy or learn more about how to be successful with our public policies. And you guys have been in this business a long time. And I don't feel like I gave you completely the praise due to you in terms of what you've done on water and air and schools. And we listed every initiative you guys have done in the last 20 years, would pretty much be every single initiative we know in California. So anyway, thank you for everything.
Mary.
All right.
Thank you. And I'll keep hanging if people want to find me.
Yeah, well, I think now, Rachel's going to send us back to the party. Where's Rachel? Where's our hostess?
I'm sending
There's
Okay.